This is Flare and Flow by TheLegandOfChel on AO3. Chapter 8, Ripple. Over the last few months, Keith had always imagined he'd feel an immense wave of relief once they'd finally made it to the famed walled city. Instead, Keith felt like he was marching into the gallows. He couldn't stop the thoughts bouncing around frantically in his head. Had Shiro already made it to Ba Sing Se? Had he been captured? Shiro was smart. Maybe he figured out it was a trap and was lying low waiting to warn Keith. Oh, spirits. What if he never even made it out of the Fire Nation in the first place? What if this whole time, while Keith had been going to festivals and playing Capture the Flag, Shiro was wasting away in a prison cell, wondering why his brother hadn't come to break him out? A warm hand covered his own, stopping the statico tapping of his finger and jolting him out of his spiraling panic. Keith raised his head to meet Lance's concerned eyes. "You okay?" he asked softly. "Not really," Keith admitted. "I'm worried about Shiro." Lance squeezed his hand with a smile. "I'm sure he's fine, and if he isn't, we'll just have to rescue him. No big." Keith let out a huff of laughter. "I guess you're right." "Usually am," Lance winked. Lotor turned to let them know they were almost at the city. Keith's nerves returned with a vengeance, and he gripped Lance's hand for support. The waterbender didn't seem to mind. "Now remember our cover story," Pidge said sternly as they began to descend. "Keep it simple. We're just a group of friends out traveling the world. Hunk and I are thinking about applying for the university, so we dragged you guys along to take a tour. And, of course, Keith can bend air and nothing else." "I mean, that is basically why Hunk and I were going," Lance shrugged. "It is?" Now Keith felt a pang of guilt on top of everything else, as he realized he had never actually asked the others reasons for going to the metropoles. He'd been pretty distracted by being on the run, and then the Avatar business, and then getting kidnapped, but still. Lance didn't seem fazed, though, and broke into a wide grin. "Yeah, Hunk and I met when we were little, but since we lived on different continents, the majority of our friendship has been as pen pals. But we really wanted to do something fun together before our families made us settle down and get jobs. And Hunk was thinking about going to the university in Ba Sing Se and wanted to check it out, so I just tagged along." Lance chuckled bashfully, rubbing the back of his neck. "I know compared to you and Pidge, our reasons must seem kind of boring." Keith shook his head with a smile. "Not at all. If anything, I'm just glad you weren't about to reveal another dramatic secret. I think I've had enough of those for a lifetime. If you told me you were actually the son of the water tribe chief on a mission to assassinate the Earth Queen or something, I'd probably jump off this flying bison." "Don't worry," Lance assured. "I'm just his great-nephew." Keith snorted, but when Lance didn't join in, Keith paused. "Wait, are you serious?" "It's not a big deal. There are like 15 people between me and the throne." "Keith, no!" Lance latched onto Keith as he moved towards the edge of the saddle, Keith trying valiantly to keep his deadpan expression in face of Lance's laughter. They were never going to find Shiro. Not because something nefarious had befallen him, no, but because Ba Sing Se was fucking huge. The National University alone was as big as the Fire Nation's whole capital. How were they supposed to track down Shiro without giving themselves away when their only point of contact was a man that hadn't been seen in months, and who, if they asked for, would probably alert all of Lotor's spies that they were here? The only good news was that Keith's disguise appeared to be a success, as no one gave him a second glance, despite several more wanted posters plastered around the city. That was one less thing to worry about, but didn't really help with their main objective. The group split up and spent hours wandering the campus, keeping an eye out for anyone matching Shiro's description, and an ear to the ground for rumors of Shiro or Lotor. "Maybe Alora could try that spirit tracking spell," Lance suggested after the third unsuccessful day of searching. "Like she used to find you." When they all turned to the Airbender, she shook her head. "I'm afraid that would only work if I had something imbued with his aura. And even then, the city is so crowded. It would be extremely difficult to pinpoint an individual soul. Although," she tapped her cheek, looking skyward in concentration, "if I was already familiar with it, I might have a chance." "But you never met Shiro, have you?" Pidge asked. "No," Alora replied, "but I imagine Keith is close enough to him that he would be able to recognize it even here." "Me?" Keith blinked. "But I still haven't been able to visit the spirit world or enter the Avatar state. I doubt I'd be able to do such a complicated technique. It's up to you, of course, Laura said. I'm just not sure what other options we have right now. Besides, continuing to search on foot. Keith furrowed his eyebrows in thought. After a moment, he nodded. Let's give it a try. Keith sat cross-legged on the floor, eyes closed as Laura's voice washed over him in soothing tones. Twilight shone through the sheer curtains of the room they were staying in. Empty your mind, Laura murmured. Find that which connects you to the spirit world. Let the physical fall away. Breathing rhythmically, Keith let himself fall into the meditative state that had become familiar after days of practice. Now, Laura continued, focus on the bond between you and Shiro. Recall how you feel when the two of you are together. A picture of his brother came forth in his mind. Emotions welled up inside him. Affection, trust, gratitude, worry. They swirled together like a storm in a bottle. The more he thought about Shiro, the greater his concern became, chasing the peaceful zen from his grasp. How was he supposed to empty his mind if all he could think about was Shiro being tortured or worse? With a sigh of frustration, Keith opened his eyes. Laura, this isn't working. We've been at it for hours. Maybe we should try something else. Laura didn't respond, deep in meditation. Keith got up and patted over to her. Laura? The avatar reached out to touch her shoulder, only to gasp when his hand went right through. Glancing around with wide eyes, Keith finally noticed things looked off, like the colors weren't quite right. Keith whipped around to look back at where he had been sitting, and sure enough, there was his body. He'd done it. Keith stared down at his hands. Looking closer, he could see that they were slightly translucent. Struck with the thought, Keith lifted his feet and grinned when he hovered above the floor. Keith gave himself a little shake. As exciting as this was, he had a mission. He successfully astral projected, but how to find Shiro? Suddenly, he became aware of a presence behind him. Keith spun around and his eyes widened. Standing before him was a huge lion, crimson in color and faintly glowing. His large mane flickered around his head like flames. Keith cautiously glided closer to the spirit. You're the red lion of fire, he breathed. What are you doing here? He glanced back at Laura. We've been trying to find the white lion. Do you know where she is? If the lion could speak, he gave no indication, merely staring back at Keith impassively. Okay, Keith frowned thoughtfully. Maybe he sensed Keith's worry and came to help him. Laura did say they had a special connection. I'm looking for my brother. Have you seen him? At this, the lion turned and looked back at Keith. He still didn't speak, but Keith felt an impression of thought pushed against his mind. You want me to get on? The lion nodded, and Keith floated higher in the air, settling down on the beast's back. Not sure where to hold on, Keith simply gripped the strands of his long crimson mane. Once Keith was ready, the lion shot off. Keith let out a small yelp as they barreled through the wall of the third-floor bedroom. Oh, right. They were still in spirit form. Keith could feel the lion's amusement at his expense, but any embarrassment was quickly forgotten as they ascended higher and higher. Keith couldn't help the thrill that ran through him. Alora's bison was great, but this was a whole new level of freedom. The red lion's paws raced over an invisible path as they flew across the sky. The setting sun cast a warm glow as it sank below the horizon and bathed the city below in golden hues. Keith wasn't sure how much time passed, but soon they were touching down. Dismounting, Keith kept one hand buried in the red lion's mane as they walked through the area. The lion had brought him to what appeared to be an abandoned section of the slums just outside the city. Or at least Keith thought it was abandoned, but as he followed the lion down the decrepit street, he noticed guards scattered here and there, hidden in alleys and peeking through boarded-up windows. Although no one should be able to see or hear them, Keith remained vigilant as the lion led him into a house. They passed a few soldiers posted around the entryways and found two more standing in front of the locked door. Keith and the red lion phased through the door and walked down the stairs into a large cell. Huddled in a makeshift jail cell was a single figure. Shiro! Keith rushed over to examine his brother. Shiro clutched his arm like it was injured, and the bags under his eyes suggested that he hadn't slept well in days. But Keith didn't see anything that looked immediately life-threatening. Thank the spirits. Keith kneeled beside his brother and wished he could communicate with him somehow. Don't worry, Shiro. I'll get you out of here, I promise. The two firebenders looked up as the cell door swung open. Good evening, Shiro. How are you holding up? You gave the guards quite a run around today. Keith's blood ran cold despite not being in his body. Shiro merely glared. Pretty sure they broke my arm, so I'd say we're even. Yes, a pity that happened to you, Lotor agreed immensely as he walked down the steps. I'm more than willing to bring a healer in to look at it. All I ask in return is that you tell me where Keith is. Shiro bared his teeth. Never. Keith was reeling. He knew Lotor had sent people after him, but he never expected the prince himself to be in Ba Sing Se. Lotor let out a put-upon sigh. Very well. It really makes little difference to me in the end. Sooner or later, Keith will come to Ba Sing Se looking for you, or someone will recognize him and take him back to the Fire Nation. Either way, the result is the same. Keith is smart, and he has good instincts, Shiro replied. He'll figure out something is wrong. Oh, I'm counting on it. Lotor smirked. It wouldn't be much fun otherwise, now would it? Is that all this is to you? Shiro demanded. A game? Of course not. You may not believe me, but I truly care for your brother, Lotor said, though I will confess his defiance is refreshing. Keith challenges me like no one ever has. And so you fell for him, is that it? You're right. I don't believe you. I need not to prove anything to you, Lotor sneered. But know this, I do love Keith, and he will be mine. He may be reluctant at first, but over time I'm sure he will come to his senses. Now, with a billowing of his robes, Lotor swept out of the cell. I suggest you try to get some sleep, and I'll see about getting someone to come take a look at that arm in the morning. Wouldn't want Keith to think I've been mistreating you, now would we? Lance, cut it out. Staring at him isn't going to make Keith come back any faster. Lance tore his gaze from where it had been glued to Keith's lifeless body to glower at Pidge. I can't help it. He looks like a corpse, and it's been hours. Shouldn't he have woken up by now? What if something happened? What if he's stuck in the spirit world? Lance let out a loud gasp. What if Keith got eaten by a spirit monster? I assure you, Keith did not get eaten. Allura rolled her eyes. She had become much more casual with them over time. Usually Lance was all for that, but he didn't appreciate her sass right now. He's not technically in the spirit world. He just astral projected his own spirit into the physical world, so while he might come across other spirits, I highly doubt he's in any real danger. Lance crossed his arms and pouted. Well, that's good, but why isn't he back yet? Allura shrugged, a concerned frown marring her face. I'm afraid I don't know. Lance sighed and turned his gaze back to the avatar. After getting the okay from Allura, they had moved Keith's body into a more comfortable position, lying on the bed. Honestly, it looked more like he was sleeping than dead, as his chest moved with slow breaths and he retained the color in his cheeks. But still. Maybe it was the knowledge that Keith's spirit was elsewhere, but Lance felt unease looking at him. No one said anything as Lance moved to perch beside him on the bed, taking Keith's limp hand in one of his own. Lance used his other hand to gently brush Keith's ivory bangs away from his closed eyes. Please wake up soon, Keith, he murmured. We're all starting to get pretty worried. As if on cue, Keith's hand gave the tiniest of twitches. Lance squeezed back, leaning forward eagerly with wide eyes. Keith? As the others gathered around, Keith's eyes slowly fluttered open to see Lance's grinning face. Lance? Hey, man, welcome back. Keith moved the sit-up only to stumble and clutch his head like he had gotten dizzy. Lance scrambled to help prop him up, wrapping an arm around the smaller boy's shoulders for support. Whoa, it feels weird to be back in my body, Keith said. Allura nodded. It can be a bit jarring the first few times. You should readjust fairly quickly. True to her words, within moments, Keith recovered and told them about what he had learned. He didn't move away from where he was leaning against Lance, though, and Lance, in turn, kept his arm around the avatar. So, Shiro was here after all, concluded Pidge. You didn't happen to hear anything about my dad, did you? I'm sorry. No. Pidge sighed. Worth a shot. So, what's the plan? Asked Hunk. Are we just gonna bust in and rescue him? To everyone's surprise, Keith shook his head. Normally, I'd say yes, but it turns out Lotor's here too, he explained, and as much as I'd like to punch him in the smug face, it probably would be smarter to try and avoid him. Stealth it is then, Pidge said. But how? If this is the trap, that means they'll be expecting us. They probably got guards around the whole area. It's going to be pretty difficult to get in or out. After a moment of contemplative silence, Hunk turned to Keith. Hey, I know you flew there on a magical line and everything, but if I showed you a map of Ba Sing Se, do you think you could pinpoint Shiro's location? Keith nodded. You have an idea? Hunk grinned and outlined his plan. After some deliberation, the group decided to rescue Shiro the following night, once they made the necessary preparations. Just hold on, Shiro, Keith thought. We're coming. Keith followed closely behind Hunk as the Earthbender forged a tunnel several feet underground, a small flame in the Avatar's hand to light their way. Behind them, Lance and Allura walked single file, with Pidge bringing up the rear, ready to earthbend at any sign of trouble. Eventually, Hunk slowed to a stop and turned to his companions. Okay, if my calculations are right, based on the location Keith showed us, we should be getting pretty close to Shiro's cell. I'm gonna start tunneling at more of an incline, so we're closer to the surface once we get there. Pidge, see if you can feel where he is. Hunk continued to work, and Keith could feel the ground beneath his feet start to gently slope upwards. After about 15 minutes, Pidge halted them. There's someone sitting right above us, she said, and a bunch more scattered around the building and surrounding area. I'm pretty sure the one by himself is Shiro. Hunk began digging straight up, careful to go slowly and quietly as possible. They didn't know if Lotor had hired any earthbenders who might feel the vibrations. Finally, he motioned for Keith to go forward. The Avatar quickly climbed up using the footholds Hunk had cleverly thought to embed in the tunnel's walls. At the top, Keith used his own earthbending to carve an opening in the floor and peeked out. Looking around, he found himself in the same room he had visited as a spirit, huddled against the wall with Shiro, his arm now in a sling and his eyes closed in fitful slumber. After double-checking no one else was in the cellar, Keith hoisted himself out of the tunnel and padded over to Shiro, vaguely aware of the others climbing up behind him. Careful not to jostle his injury, Keith gently shook his brother's shoulder. Shiro, he whispered, wake up. Shiro's eyes snapped open, flame gathering in his left palm, his whole body rigid with tension. Upon recognizing Keith, however, the fire went out, and Shiro stared in disbelief. Keith? How did you? Shiro's gaze flitted between Keith and his friends. Who? Keith shook his head. I'll explain everything later, but for now we have to get out of here. The older firebender seemed to get over his shock, and his eyes became serious. Keith, you can't be here, he warned. It's a trap. I know. That's why we have to leave now, before Lotor realizes we're here. Keith pulled his brother's uninjured arm over his shoulder and helped him to his feet. Lance scurried to Shiro's other side and to lend support as well. Shiro shook his head urgently. No, Keith, you don't understand. What is your brother trying to say? Oh, wait, what your brother is trying to say, a smooth voice cut in, is that it's already far too late. Keith froze as his eyes darted up to the cellar door. There stood the Prince of the Fire Nation, surrounded by a handful of guards and a couple of men who appeared to be earthbenders, judging by their clothes, wearing that charming yet condescending smile Keith was oh so familiar with. Lotor walked down the stairs with an air of casual grace. I'm impressed, he said. I thought I would catch you when you went looking for your brother at the university, and that there was only a slim chance you'd make it all the way here. But then you have always exceeded my expectations. That's why I hired these fine gentlemen to monitor the area. They felt you coming a mile away. The prince tapped his bottom lip, gazing upward as if in thought. Well, perhaps not quite a mile, but you get the idea. Lotor's gaze swept over the others. I also wasn't expecting you to bring guests. Aren't you going to introduce us? No. Keith scowled. Lotor shrugged. No matter. Depending on how this goes, they might not be around much longer anyway. Keith's friends all shifted into combat-ready positions. Keith himself moved so that he was slightly blocking Shiro, who wasn't in any condition to fight. Is that a threat? Keith snarled. Lotor's lackey shifted stances as well, but the prince merely sighed and raised his hands in a peaceful gesture. Not at all. His smile was the fakest-looking one Keith had seen yet. I just meant that soon you and I will return to the Fire Nation, and I'm afraid your little friends here will not be welcome to join us. Keith isn't going anywhere with you, Lance interrupted. His blue eyes were dark as he glared at the prince. Lotor regarded the waterbender with cool disinterest for a moment, then turned back to Keith. Come now, my dear. He held out his hand, ignoring Lance's spluttering. You've had your fun, but it's time to go home. Before Keith could respond, Lance stepped forward, fire in his eyes. Why don't you get it? Keith doesn't want to go with you. In fact, he hates your guts. Like a switch had been flipped, Lotor's magnanimous smile shattered, replaced by rage. Lance only barely managed to avoid the plume of blue fire by lunging out of the way, though judging by the smell in the air, his clothes had been singed. Everyone else took this as a sign that the standoff was over, and leapt into battle. Elements and weapons of every kind clashed. Lotor didn't even pause as he rained more strikes upon the waterbender. Lance! Keith moved to help him, but Lance's shout stopped him in his tracks. Get Shiro to safety, Lance ordered, ducking a fiery kick. I got this. Keith hesitated, reluctant to leave the other boy to fight Lotor one-on-one, but he knew Lance was right. Judging by the way he still slumped against Keith, his brother was more injured than he let on, so there was no way he could leave Shiro alone in what had become a war zone, or let him join the fight. Keith started to lead Shiro back to the tunnel, but quickly realized they wouldn't be able to escape that way when Lotor had earthbenders on his side. They could easily follow him or even collapse the tunnel. They would have to find another way out. Alora, Keith shuffled over to the airbender. Can you summon Platt? We're gonna need a ride. I can try, she answered while deflecting a flying chunk of rock. He's back at the end, so it could take a while for him to get here. Do it, Keith said. His gaze swept over the room. The cellar wasn't that small, but there were quite a few combatants in the limited space. They'd have a better chance out in the open. Plus, that way, it would be easier to get on Platt. Just as he was trying to think the best way to get everyone outside, short of just running upstairs and hoping they would all follow, the answer came in the form of Lance and Lotor. The two had been dueling for the last few minutes, bending their respective elements and dodging each other's attacks. Suddenly, Lotor blasted a huge fireball. At the same time, Lance shot a wave of water. The two blue elements collided and instantly filled the room with hot steam. Several startled cries rang out. Not only was it hard to see, but Keith could already feel his clothes becoming damp as sweat beaded on his brow. A tunnel of wind blew across the room, clearing a path. This way! Alora's voice shouted. Keith tightened his grip on Shiro and hurried into the air tunnel. It was instantly cooler, and he could see the exit. Unfortunately, it also made him a visible target. Keith didn't see the shadows reaching out from the cloud of steam, but Shiro did. Keith, watch out! Shiro pushed Keith out of the way just as one of the Fire Nation soldiers attacked with a sword to the air too humid to firebend. The tip of the blade slashed through his skin and Shiro fell to the ground. He saw red. Without thinking, he bent the moisture out of the air to form a water whip and slammed it against the soldier's chest, sending him flying into the wall. When the soldier didn't get back up, Keith spun and dropped down next to his brother. Shiro, are you okay? Keith asked worriedly. Shiro grimaced and brought his hand down from where it had been clutching his face. The blade had cut a thin line across the bridge of his nose. It looked painful, but thankfully not life-threatening. I'll be all right, he said as Keith slung his arm over his shoulders again. But did you just bend water? Oh, yeah, Keith said, helping Shiro to the stairs. There's a lot I need to tell you, but long story short, I'm the Avatar? Shiro blinked. He opened his mouth, then closed it, then blinked again. Oh, he finally said. Okay, that's it? Keith quirked an eyebrow. Okay? Oh, we'll talk more, trust me, Shiro replied. Once we're out of mortal danger and I can freak out without getting us all killed. They finally made it out to the blissfully arid surface to find most of the others had already escaped the cellar and resumed their fight. Alora blew into her bison whistle as she traded blows with an enemy earthbender, and Pigeon Hunk worked together against the 3 Fire Nation soldiers. Lance and Lotor were nowhere to be seen. Keith brought Shiro into an alley a little ways away and set him down. I have to go find Lance, he said. You stay here out of sight. Alora's calling her sky bison, so if it gets here before I get back, get on it, okay? Oh, Keith! Shiro struggled to get up. I'm sorry, I don't have time to explain. Lance needs my help. Keith raced back into the building, ignoring Shiro's calls. He raced back down into the cellar. The steam had dissipated somewhat thanks to Alora's bending, but it was still hard to see anything. Lance! Keith called out. Are you here? And just as he was debating airbending the rest of the steam out, Keith heard a low groan. He hurried towards the source and found Lance lying prone on the ground. Lance! Keith kneeled down beside the other boy. Are you okay? Lance gave a weak cough, but managed to shoot Keith a crooked smile. Think I might have blacked out there for a minute, but other than that, I'm golden. Keith gently ran his fingers over Lance's scalp, and Lance winced as he brushed against a large bump. There was a bit of blood on his fingers when he pulled them away. You might have a concussion. Keith bit his lip. I bet you could kiss it better. Lance grinned lopsidedly. Keith chuckled. Maybe later. First, let's get out of here so you can see a real doctor. And then kisses? We'll see. Keith stood back up and reached down to help Lance to his feet. Before Lance could take his hand, someone grabbed Keith's wrist and yanked the avatar away. His back hit a wall, and Keith looked up to see Lotor's face leering down at him. Hello again, the prince purred. Looks like I finally caught you. I like your hair, by the way. Did you miss me that much? Lotor's own silvery locks had never been anything less than perfect, even during the Agni Kai. Now, however, they were in disarray, no doubt from the fighting and the steam. The loose hairs around his face, combined with his wide eyes and his shortness of breath, gave the prince a rather manic appearance. Keith scowled. He tried to pull his wrists out of Lotor's grasp, but the prince didn't budge. Keith brought his other hand to punch him, but Lotor caught that one as well. Let me go, Keith snarled. So you can do what? Lotor replied. Even if you could firebend here, we both know who would win. So why even bother resisting? Lotor leaned in closer, crowding Keith back against the wall. Or are you concerned over this pathetic little waterbender? Lotor shot Lance a derisive look as Lance struggled to get up off the ground. Look at him. What could he possibly offer you? Let me go, Keith growled. Or what? Lotor mocked. Keith! Lance could barely stand, but he threw the remains of his water whip at him. Lotor's condescending sneer became wide-eyed shock as Keith slipped out of his grasp and bent the water to push Lotor against the wall in his place. Before the prince could recover, Keith froze the whip and pulled more moisture from the air to trap him against the wall, though he was careful to leave enough humidity to keep it difficult for Lotor to firebend his way out. Keith unsheathed his mother's knife and held it up to the prince's throat. Lotor didn't look scared, though. If anything, the way he looked at Keith could only be described as hungry. Keith decided to ignore how disconcerted that made him feel. Call off the engagement, he demanded, and the bounty on me. Oh, what? Lotor asked casually. You'll kill me? You think I won't? Keith narrowed his eyes and pressed the blade harder. No, I don't, Lotor replied. He paused for a long moment. However, in light of recent revelations, I'm willing to grant your request. You are? Keith warily pulled back. Why the sudden change of heart? On the contrary, my heart remains as it has always been yours. But I realize now that taking you back by force will only make you keep trying to get away. So I've decided instead I'll make you want to be with me. That's never going to happen. We'll see. But I promise, on my honor, if you let me go now, I'll call off my men, and you and your little friends can leave. And I'll send word to cancel the bounty, Lotor added. Keith regarded the prince for another moment before he bent the ice away. Keeping an eye on him, Keith helped Lance to his feet and slung his arm over Keith's shoulders. You're just gonna believe him? Lance glared at Lotor, which the prince returned with a curl of his lip. He swore on his honor, Keith replied. Trust me when I say that's a big deal where we come from. The rest of the day went by in a surreal haze. They returned above ground to find Alora, Pidge, and Hunk fighting the last two soldiers, having already beaten the rest. Shiro was also helping them, despite Keith's order to stay out of harm's way. They were all understandably confused when Lotor ordered his men to retreat and allowed them to go on Platte without any difficulty, but they seemed to accept Keith's promise to explain things later. Before they took off, Lotor called out, "Don't think this is the end, Keith. We will meet again, and next time you'll be coming to me of your own volition." The prince's eyes glimmered in that way that always made Keith feel like he knew something Keith didn't. "Farewell, Avatar." As they flew into the sky, Keith looked back down to where Lotor stood. The prince's hungry eyes remained locked with his own until he disappeared from sight.